The world did not slow down this week. It accelerated, collided with itself, and left us all scrambling to understand what exactly just happened. And if you are watching this right now, you already sense something is fundamentally wrong out there. You just cannot quite put your finger on all of it. Stick with me, because I am going to try to put my finger on every single piece. And if this kind of analysis is what you want more of, subscribe right now, because this is what we do here every week. Let us begin where the week demanded we begin, with a President of the United States on the record with Axios telling the Prime Minister of Israel something that would have been unthinkable even 12 months ago. Bibi, Donald Trump reportedly said, "You better be careful or you will be on your own very soon." Those words, from Donald Trump to Benjamin Netanyahu. Let that settle for a moment, because this is the same Trump who spent his entire first term and the opening stretch of his second giving Netanyahu weapons, diplomatic cover, and the green light while the entire region burned. And now, for the first time, we are watching the two men who launched Operation Epic Fury together on February the 28th. The operation that started this war, that killed the Iranian supreme leader, that sent oil past $120 a barrel and shook the foundations of the global economy. We are watching those two men begin to fracture. That fracture matters enormously. Not because it is pleasant to witness, but because it tells us something deep about where American interests have arrived in this conflict, and it is not where Netanyahu wants them to be. Here is the factual sequence. On Sunday, June the 7th, Iran launched ballistic missiles at northern Israel, following Israeli strikes on Hezbollah targets in Beirut. Trump called Netanyahu and asked him not to retaliate. Netanyahu, according to Israeli media, consulted with senior security officials and launched strikes on Iranian air defense systems and a petrochemical plant anyway. Fighter jets were reportedly already on the runway for a much larger attack before Trump intervened a second time. Netanyahu cancelled the major strike, but the smaller one had already gone. Iran hit a facility in Haifa in return. No deaths were reported on either side. And then Netanyahu appeared on television to say Israel had agreed to lower the temperature, while simultaneously making clear that Israel decides, and Israel alone, when to use military force. He said it softly, but he said it. Think about what that means structurally. Israel is not a party to the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed between the United States and Iran. Not a signatory, not even formally in the room. And yet Israel is continuing to strike southern Lebanon, where Hezbollah remains active, and where Hezbollah itself says Israel is not complying with any ceasefire. Israel is conducting strikes in Lebanon while the United States and Iran are trying to build a diplomatic architecture that requires Lebanon to be stable. That is a deliberate provocation, and it nearly collapsed the entire deal before the ink was dry. Iran's foreign ministry said outright that the United States is directly responsible because Washington is a party to the ceasefire negotiations and cannot control its ally. The structural reality that statement describes is accurate. The United States went into this deal promising things it cannot guarantee, because Netanyahu operates on his own timetable and has always known that Washington's will to abandon him has historically been close to zero. So what exactly is this deal? The Memorandum of Understanding, signed digitally by Trump, Vice President J.D. Vance, and Iranian Parliamentary Speaker Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, is a 14-point document that does several concrete things and defers almost everything difficult. It ends, in principle, hostilities between the United States and Iran. It reopens the Strait of Hormuz to commercial shipping, toll-free, for 60 days. It commits Iran to allowing International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors back in, and it establishes a 60-day window of negotiations during which the two sides are supposed to resolve the genuinely hard questions. What are those hard questions? The entire nuclear program, Iran's right to enrich uranium, the fate of Iran's existing stockpile of highly enriched uranium, estimated at around 440 kilograms, enriched to 60% purity, below weapons grade, but close enough that the pathway to a bomb becomes very short indeed, frozen Iranian assets worth $25 billion, sanctions relief, and the long-term governance of the Strait of Hormuz itself. Notice what the document does not resolve. It does not resolve enrichment. Iran's President Masoud Pezeshkian said on the record that Iran will never back down from its right to enrich uranium, and that the other side would be forced to accept it. Iran's supreme leader issued guidance that enriched uranium stockpiles should not be sent abroad at all. And Trump, in a New York Times interview, indicated he might permit Iran to retain low-level enrichment, a significant walkback from his earlier demand for complete dismantlement. Now compare that to the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the agreement Obama's administration negotiated in 2015 and that Trump himself tore up in 2018. The JCPOA was 159 pages of technical specificity, enrichment caps, centrifuge limits, inspection protocols, sunset clauses, every mechanism mapped out in painstaking detail. What we have now is 14 points and 60 days. It is not a deal. It is a deal to try to make a deal. And the history of 60-day diplomatic windows in American foreign policy is not reassuring. Let us talk about the Strait of Hormuz, because it deserves more attention than most coverage gives it. This is a waterway roughly 39 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, flanked by Iran on one side and Oman on the other. Approximately 20% of the world's oil and 17% of global liquefied natural gas pass through it. When Iran closed it on February the 28th, oil went past $120 per barrel within days. The International Energy Agency called it the greatest global energy security challenge in the history of the oil market. That is not hyperbole. What happened was not just an energy crisis, it was a cascading systems failure. Shipping insurance collapsed. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all exports. Gulf states that rely on the strait for their grocery imports began facing food security risks. The Gulf Cooperation Council's entire economic model, built on the assumption of permanent, frictionless maritime access, started coming apart. Iran reopened the strait as part of the memorandum framework, but with conditions. The document specifies safe passage with no charge for 60 days only. After 60 days, Iran intends to negotiate a fee for services. Iran's lead negotiator said directly that the strait will not return to pre-war conditions. Vance said explicitly that if Iran tries to propose tolls, there will not be a final deal. So we have two parties who have agreed to stop shooting while fundamentally disagreeing about who controls one of the most important waterways on the planet. And remember, there are an estimated 80 mines in the strait that still need to be cleared. This reopening is real but fragile, sitting on top of a 60-day countdown that began with both sides already talking past each other. Pakistan and Qatar served as the key mediators here. Pakistan's Prime Minister Shehbaz Sharif and Staff Field Marshal Asim Munir met directly with Vance at the Bergenstock Resort in Switzerland. Qatar played its now familiar role as the diplomatic bridge between Washington and Tehran. And here is a detail that did not receive the attention it deserved. Iran refused to stand beside the Pakistani and Qatari mediators on camera. The signing that was supposed to happen in Switzerland did not happen as a public ceremony at all. Trump signed in Versailles. Iran signed separately. No shared podium, no handshake, no moment of visual diplomacy that normally anchors these agreements in public consciousness and makes them harder to walk back. That absence is not accidental. It reflects the political difficulty on the Iranian side, where hardliners have never accepted the premise of this negotiation, and where being photographed shaking hands with the Americans remains politically toxic at home. Now, China. Because you cannot understand this story without China. Beijing backed Iran diplomatically from the moment the war began, and materially as well. There are credible reports of dual-use technology with military applications flowing from China to Iran. Foreign Minister Wang Yi called the initial American and Israeli strikes unacceptable, condemned what he called the blatant killing of a sovereign leader, and warned that the situation was being pushed toward a dangerous abyss. Russia went further in some respects. Putin issued personal condolences over the killing of Supreme Leader Khamenei and called it a cynical violation of all norms of human morality and international law. Both countries condemned the strikes as violations of the United Nations Charter, and Article 2, Paragraph 4 of that charter does indeed prohibit the use of force against the territorial integrity of another state, and both used the conflict to amplify a broader argument they have been making for years, that American unilateralism is the fundamental threat to global order. Here is the analytical point that matters most about the China-Russia position. Neither country responds to this deal in the same way. Russia benefited economically from high oil prices. A Hormuz closure above $100 a barrel is genuinely good for Russian revenue. A deal that drops oil to $73 or $74 hurts Russia directly. China, the world's largest oil importer, was paying more for energy throughout this entire conflict than almost any other economy. A deal that opens the strait and brings prices down serves concrete Chinese interests. But Beijing does not want an Iran that has been diplomatically subjugated by the United States, because that would represent a significant expansion of American power in a region where China has spent years building influence through the Belt and Road Initiative, infrastructure investment, and arms relationships. So China wants lower oil prices. It does not want American hegemony validated by this war. And it will use whatever leverage the 60-day window provides to make sure that does not happen. Let us state what this war has done to the global economy plainly, because the numbers matter. The OECD forecasts that United States inflation will reach 4.2% this year, more than double the Federal Reserve's 2% target, driven by energy prices up 23.5% year on year. Gold hit $4,200 an ounce as markets repriced geopolitical risk in real time. The European Central Bank postponed its planned interest rate reductions in March and raised inflation forecasts, warning that Germany, Italy, and Britain face genuine recession risks if maritime disruption continues. Oil stabilized near $73 to $74 per barrel this week, down from those devastating peaks, but still carrying months of accumulated economic damage. Disrupted supply chains, elevated shipping costs, the psychological premium of a world that now knows this waterway can be closed. And then there is Britain. Which brings us to the second major story of this week. Keir Starmer stood outside 10 Downing Street on Monday morning, June the 22nd, and announced his resignation as Labour leader. He will remain as caretaker Prime Minister until a new leader is chosen, with nominations opening July the 9th. His voice cracked near the end of his statement. He said he had spoken to His Majesty the King. He said he had heard the answer of his parliamentary party to the question of whether he was best placed to lead them into the next election, and he accepted that answer with good grace. The context is everything here. Starmer won one of the largest Labour majorities in modern British political history in July 2024. He was the stability candidate, the serious man after the chaos of Boris Johnson, Liz Truss, and Rishi Sunak. He promised explicitly that what the Conservatives had given Britain, the chaos of constantly changing leaders, was what Labour would not repeat. Less than 2 years later, he is gone, and Britain is about to have its 7th Prime Minister in a decade. 7 leaders in 10 years. The Fixed-Term Parliaments Act, passed in 2011 with the explicit intention of preventing this kind of parliamentary instability, was repealed in 2022. The consequences of that repeal are now playing out in real time. What brought Starmer down was a combination of forces that represent a systemic crisis rather than merely a personal failure. The local elections of May 2026 were catastrophic for Labour. Nigel Farage's Reform United Kingdom made historic gains, winning hundreds of council seats and establishing itself as a genuine national force rather than a protest movement. Then Andy Burnham, the former Greater Manchester mayor who had openly discussed plans to challenge Starmer's leadership, won a parliamentary by-election in Makerfield and cleared the constitutional hurdle. You need to be a sitting member of parliament to stand for the party leadership. That turned Burnham from a threat into an inevitability. Cabinet ministers began resigning. Wes Streeting, who had indicated he himself might run, endorsed Burnham instead. By the weekend, even Trump had weighed in on Truth Social, writing that Starmer had failed badly on immigration and energy, an intervention that, whatever you think of its source, was devastating in its political timing. Burnham is now the overwhelming favourite to become Prime Minister, potentially as soon as September. He enters the contest with enormous momentum and a reputation built on a decade of vocal advocacy for Northern England. He spoke about building a new politics based on unity and hope. These are large words. The question is whether they mean anything substantive in an environment this hostile. Farage is already sharpening his knives. He published an essay on Monday demanding a snap general election, arguing that the country cannot afford to waste another week drifting from crisis to crisis. Under British constitutional law, there is no obligation to call an election simply because a party changes its leader. Gordon Brown declined to do so in 2007 after succeeding Tony Blair, and faced relentless political pressure as a result. But Farage is leading in more than 300 consecutive opinion polls, and the argument that Labour is governing without a fresh mandate from voters does not disappear just because the Constitution does not require an election. So here is where everything stands as of today, June the 23rd. In the Middle East, the United States and Iran have a memorandum of understanding that is already under strain. The Strait of Hormuz is technically open, but not fully demined and not stably governed. Israel is still striking Lebanon, in direct contradiction of what the deal requires. Netanyahu has been warned by his most important ally that he could be left alone, and he has responded by saying Israel will exercise its right to self-defense whenever necessary, regardless of what Washington wants. China and Russia are watching, rhetorically aligned with Iranian sovereignty, each pursuing their own interests through the diplomatic noise. The global economy is sitting at a fragile equilibrium. Oil down, gold elevated, inflation still hot, and a 60-day clock ticking on whether a real deal gets made or the whole thing collapses back into conflict. Where does this go from here? The most honest answer is that nobody knows, and anyone telling you otherwise is not being straight with you. But the enrichment question is the one that breaks or makes this deal. If the United States accepts Iran's right to low-level enrichment, a deal becomes possible. But the Israeli government will react with fury, and Netanyahu will face enormous domestic pressure from coalition partners like National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, who said this week that 1,000 Lebanese mothers must weep for every Israeli death. That is not a figure of speech from someone inclined toward compromise. If the deal fails, the United States faces a choice between relaunching military strikes, which Trump himself flagged as a possibility, or accepting an Iran that has used 60 days to recover and potentially accelerate exactly the nuclear activities the deal was supposed to constrain. Britain's next chapter is, in some ways, a microcosm of the same dynamic playing out everywhere. Populations exhausted by war-driven inflation, energy insecurity, and the sense that established parties have failed them are turning toward movements that promise rupture. The question Andy Burnham will have to answer is whether there is a credible politics of hope that can compete with the politics of anger on terrain this difficult. What this week tells us, above everything else, is that the world built after 1945, the one governed by the United Nations Charter, by collective security, by the idea that military force requires multilateral authorization, that world is under unprecedented pressure. Article 51 of the Charter permits self-defense, but what happened in February was a preemptive war against a state in the middle of active diplomacy, with no Security Council mandate and no mechanism for accountability. The consequences, the oil shock, the inflation, the political collapses in allied democracies, the widening axis between China and Russia, and a battered but surviving Iran. These are not accidents. They are the predictable result of a world where the rules apply selectively, where power determines who must comply, and where the bill eventually comes due for everyone, including the countries that thought they were in charge. If you stayed with me this far, thank you. Comment below and tell me what you think I got wrong, or what you want me to dig deeper into next week. Like this video if you think more people should see it, and subscribe, because this is only going to get more complicated from here.